We don't hear much Latin these days. I don't suppose that comes as much of a surprise, but for more than 1,000 years it was the backbone of European thought, law, education, and religion. Latin was once the language that tied together the Western world and was the very foundation of the Romance languages we speak today: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. They all descended from Latin. But how did Latin break up into so many dialects and national tongues? The answer lies partly in the nature of Latin itself. Its grammar is complex and confusing, and that became its undoing. Over time, the vowel sounds that carried meaning in its system of cases and tenses grew ambiguous in everyday speech. The spoken Latin of ordinary people, so-called vulgar Latin, slowly deteriorated into the local vernaculars that later became the national languages of Europe. Even after the fall of Rome, Latin remained in general use. For well over 1,000 years, it was the medium through which Europe thought, reasoned, prayed, and recorded its knowledge. That's not to say it didn't undergo any changes, and several efforts were made to revive and restore its clarity at various times. A major turning point came in 800 AD, when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans. That's right, Emperor of the Romans. It was the first time since the fall of Rome in 476 that a Western European ruler was given that title. But this wasn't just ceremony, it was politics. By crowning Charlemagne, the Pope signalled that imperial power came through the Church, not from the old Roman state or the Byzantine emperor. This act laid the foundation for what would become the Holy Roman Empire. In other words, what has become the European civilization we are familiar with is a continuation of the might of Rome. The crowning of Charlemagne also marked a new alliance between church and state, one that would shape Europe for centuries. Although Latin never disappeared, it remained the language of the church, law, and scholarship throughout the Middle Ages. There was a marked revival of interest in classical learning during the 12th century. This renewed energy was fueled in part by increased contact with the Islamic world, where many ancient and Roman texts had been preserved, translated, and studied. As these works made their way back into Western Europe, they ignited a fresh wave of intellectual activity, particularly in cathedral schools and the nascent universities. This intellectual reawakening laid the foundations for the Renaissance, a broader cultural flourishing that by the 15th and 16th centuries gave rise to humanism. Figures like Erasmus, Petrarch, and later Montaigne, though he wrote primarily in French, were central to this movement. The humanists sought to recover not just the content, but the style and spirit of classical antiquity. They revered the Latin of Cicero, Virgil, and Livy, which they regarded as a model of eloquence and moral seriousness. In contrast, they saw the Latin of the Middle Ages, though still widely used, as degraded by technical jargon and stylistic carelessness. Whether this judgment was entirely fair is debatable, but it fueled a deliberate return to classical forms and rhetoric. The result was a period of extraordinary literary achievement. Humanist scholars produced speeches, dialogues, philosophical treatises, and plays that were rich in wit, precision, and classical allusion. Latin was not just a medium of communication, it became a vehicle for artistic expression. Yet, over time, Latin's role began to change. As vernacular languages across Europe developed and gained prestige, Latin gradually ceded ground. It remained important, but it was no longer the sole language of learned discourse. Right up to the end of the 17th century, Latin remained the default language of communication in the scientific world, to make it accessible across national borders. Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, was one of the last major works to be published in Latin. For centuries, to be educated had meant to be fluent in Latin, as well as in your native tongue. That dual fluency was expected, and schoolboys were drilled in Latin from an early age. Latin was more than a shared means of communication. It carried the ideas that helped shape European civilization itself. Roman concepts of law, citizenship, and governance laid the foundation for Western political and legal systems. Christian thinkers such as Augustine, Jerome, and Aquinas laid moral and philosophical foundations that continued to shape European thought for centuries. At the same time, as secular philosophies, Christian thinkers such as Augustine, Jerome, and Aquinas laid moral and philosophical foundations that continued to shape European thought for centuries. At the same time, secular philosophies began to emerge more prominently from the 17th century onwards. But Latin did begin to play a less central role as time went by. Society grew more complex, and there was a growing need for a language better suited to the demands of modern bureaucracy, commerce, and administration. British colonialism carried English across the globe, but it was the East India Company that truly laid the groundwork for a global empire. It was not alone. Across Europe, chartered trading companies, the Dutch, French, Danish, and Swedish East India Companies among them, were transforming commerce into a structured global enterprise. But the British Company proved to be the most far-reaching and influential. It pioneered the merger of state power and corporate control, elevating trade to a form of governance. Its tools were not philosophical treaties, but ledgers, contracts, and military force administered by bureaucracy. The mindset it embodied demanded a language that was practical, adaptable, and standardized. That language was English, not Latin. Latin, with its emphasis on form, logic, and rhetorical elements, belonged to an earlier worldview. It was not destined to serve the needs of mass governance or instant communication. The rise of English as a global lingua franca was not accidental. It was political. A shared language is never just a convenience. It is a mechanism of control, a vehicle for exporting systems, assumptions, and authority. Then came the rise of the United States, especially after the Second World War. Enough said. And later, the Internet. These three waves, the East India Company, American hegemony, and digital globalization, cemented English as the dominant language not only in business and technology, but also in academia. The decline of Latin was more than a change in language. It was a shift in consciousness. Latin carried with it a way of thinking shaped by precision, hierarchy, and historical memory. To learn Latin was to enter into conversation with the past, a past not flattened into slogans or sound bites, but alive with nuance, contradiction, and form. As Latin faded from the curriculum, so too did this long view of civilization. Education turned increasingly toward the immediate and the functional. The past became a backdrop rather than a foundation, and language became a tool rather than a discipline. In losing Latin, we didn't just lose access to Cicero or Virgil, we lost access to the mental habits their language cultivated: reflection, restraint, proportion, and the sense that ideas exist within a lineage. Without Latin, we risk drifting through a present that forgets how it came to be, ungrounded, reactive, and increasingly susceptible to the forces that Latin once helped us to interrogate. Latin did not simply linger in British schools by accident. It remained central to the grammar school curriculum well into the 20th century. But why? Was it a mark of class distinction? A form of cultural snobbery masquerading as education? Was it inertia? What Foucault might call the quiet arbitrariness of systems that reproduce themselves without ever needing to explain why? Or was it something else entirely? A lingering belief, however unconscious, that certain forms of thought and language possess an intrinsic power to shape the mind. Whatever the reason, its survival spoke to more than tradition. Latin embodied a different ideal of what education was for: not utility, but formation; not speed, but depth; not immediate access, but initiation into something larger than itself. Wilfred Owen, the war poet, is said to have carried Horace's odes with him into the trenches of the First World War. He hadn't attended a public school. He was educated at a grammar school. That says much about the strength of the educational system through which he passed. But in the years that followed, that older vision of education began to recede. As the emphasis shifted towards measurable outcomes, economic productivity, and immediate utility, Latin gradually lost its place. And it wasn't only Latin. Interest in all natural languages began to decline. Since 2004, modern foreign languages have been optional in most British secondary schools, particularly beyond the age of 14. Yet the story doesn't end with neglect. Something else was quietly taking their place. We, we have directed our attention not to other spoken languages, but to digital ones. Unlike Latin or any natural language, programming languages are stripped of ambiguity by design. They're not shaped by centuries of culture, metaphor, or memory. They do not evolve through use, inheritance, or imagination. They are engineered for clarity, consistency, and execution. Their architecture is built around logic, binary decisions, control flow, and strict syntax. Operators like and, or, and not, and structures such as if, while, for, and switch form the backbone of their expression. There's no room for nuance, irony, or contradiction, only the clean efficiency of commands. Their purpose is not to explore meaning, but to carry out tasks. In this world, language is no longer a bridge between minds, but an instrument of control. Latin once provided a framework for thinking, a bridge across cultures, and a connection to our shared history. This shift in our linguistic environment has consequences. As programming languages became more central to education, work, and daily life, we begin, often unconsciously, to adopt their logic. We come to prize clarity over complexity, speed over depth, functionality over reflection. Is it any wonder that we read less? Not because we've become less intelligent, but because we've been trained to expect immediacy. In a world shaped by programming logic, prose feels outmoded, slow, inefficient, even indulgent. Poetry, when it survives, often does so in fragments, short, compressed, and resonant. But the kind of deep, sustained reading that prose demands, like the kind of thinking Latin once cultivated, is harder to justify in a culture that measures time in clicks and outcomes. The decline of Latin wasn't just the end of a language, it marked the beginning of cultural amnesia. As history slips out of focus, so does our sense of identity. We lose the thread that links us to the past. That's why education matters. We need teachers with historical awareness, teachers who encourage pupils to think critically and to ask questions that matter. The shallower our grasp of the past, the more likely we are to accept other people's interpretation of it. And that makes us vulnerable to bias, to persuasion, to political manipulation. I don't hold on to the past out of stubborn tradition or blind patriotism. I feel, as William Blake once did, proud of this country's spirit, but heartbroken by its condition. His poem Jerusalem is sung in stadiums and concert halls as a patriotic anthem, but it wasn't written to glorify England. It was a challenge, a cry against injustice, and a hope for something better. That's the spirit I'm holding on to. I want to understand where I come from and, more importantly, where I might be going. This series is about revisiting the past, not to admire it blindly, but to ask what we've inherited and whether it still serves us.